Welcome to another Puscast. I wish I'd called this Slackers Infectious Diseases. You know, I started podcasting years ago because of the late, great Slacker Astronomy, which was still the best podcast of all time. I thought, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. All it takes is a little arrogance and conceit, and voila, you have 3 different podcasts. Anyway, this is the Puscast, a review of the infectious disease literature. This one, in case you are interested, is covering the last 2 weeks of April in the year 2011. Ooh, such excitement. Now, there are things I gotta say because this is CME accredited. I can't carry a tune, I have no sense of rhythm, and I have no conflicts of interest. Because of that, all the opinions are mine and mine alone, which, because of my great benevolence, I foist upon you, you poor trapped bastard. So when you are finished listening to my dulcet tones, go to moremark.squarespace.com where you, yes you, can get a free half an hour of CME, thanks to Legacy Health. References are online. My growing multimedia empire is also at moremark.squarespace.com, where you will find links to various and sundry quasi-educational projects. Because the world needs more Mark Crislip. And so, with no further ado, I will go on to the literature. One of the cool things about infectious diseases, which is a subspecialty of endless coolness, is how often things relate to history of human evolution. What follows is a hypothesis, not proven, but still, I think, an interesting hypothesis nonetheless. So it turns out that there are 2 different genotypes of chickenpox, varicella zoster. There's the temperate and the tropical. The tropical strain spreads less frequently, and there are fewer outbreaks due to this disease. Consequently, there's a lot less chickenpox immunity in tropical areas. And when people move to temperate areas, such as the Pacific Northwest, they're more likely to get chickenpox as an adult. Why might this be? They hypothesized that the difference between the 2 areas would be ultraviolet light, and they hypothesized that the chickenpox in tropical areas is less susceptible to ultraviolet radiation, and that temperate viruses should be more sensitive to ultraviolet radiation. This hasn't been proven. I think it's an interesting idea, and I think it's curious that there are different genotypes in the world of chickenpox, and that there probably is environmental differences, that they evolved differently due to some environmental feature. I always like this kind of stuff. And you don't find it in other specialties, but you know me, I'm a chauvinist when it comes to infectious diseases. On a more practical note, varicella zoster can be resistant to acyclovir. As you probably know, and you should know if you take boards, it's due to thymidine kinase negative mutants, which can occur on therapy. This study looked at 3 patients who were transplant patients, and they checked simultaneous spinal fluid, vesicular, and blood VZV strains for resistance. And they found that the blood virus showed susceptibility, whereas the CSF and the vesicular varicella zoster showed resistance. They hypothesized that resistance can be compartmentalized, and so if you're worried about varicella zoster resistance in your patients, you should check for susceptibility in all the sampled bodily fluids. At some level, infectious diseases is applied. I should take that out. At some level, infectious diseases is applied evolution to understand what happens to organisms and their response to antibiotics is just Darwin. Now, resistant organisms tend to be less fit, and they tend to be outcompeted by wild-type or susceptible organism. There is a cost to being resistant to antibiotics. So, HIV is often resistant these days to the heart therapies and spread from person to person. What happens when people are infected with resistant strains of HIV? Does the resistance fade away? Well, yes and no. The answer, of course, as always, is it depends. This study looked at the development of wild type, due to BAC mutations, of patients who were infected with HIV that was resistant to a hodgepodge of viral strains. They found that some resistance to PPIs and NNRTIs stayed in the patients and only slowly faded. However, those that had resistance of the M184V/I, which is what confers resistance to lamivudine, they tended to fade away with rapid replacement with wild-type strains in patients who were infected with these types of resistance viruses. So, NNRTI and protease inhibitor mutations tends to persist in patients who are infected with resistant strains, while those who are infected with the M184V/I mutation tend to be supplanted with susceptible strains of HIV. The question, of course, is if you put those patients on lamivudine, would they rapidly develop resistance due to a small population of resistant strains, or they may remain susceptible under the onslaught of antibiotics? Is there no end of new infectious diseases? It does not appear to be the case. The New England Journal this month talks about a new infection that was isolated in China. Patients presented with fevers, thrombocytopenia, leukopenia, GI upset, and about a third of them died. So they went looking, and they found a bunyavirus. This particular virus had hitherto never ever been described before. It is the genus Phebovirus in the family of bunyavirus in the land of Oz. It's found primarily in China, as I say, so far, and its source seems to be ticks. When they looked at ticks, they found it in about 10% of ticks. You know how hard it is to draw blood from a tick? They looked for mosquitoes and didn't find it in mosquitoes. So there's yet a new virus out there. Well, it's probably an old virus, but newly described, that causes severe fever with thrombocytopenia syndrome in China. So don't let the ticks get you when you're in China. And by the way, as long as we're talking about China, Lyme is present in China as well. And it's important to know this for the purpose of taking care of our future economic overlords. This study looked at the presence of Lyme in tick samples throughout China, and they found Borrelia burgdorferi in 40% in the southern areas, and they found Borrelia garnii in 40% of the ticks in the northern parts of the country. They also found Borrelia afzelii in 28% of ticks, and Borrelia valaisiana, Valaisiana, in 22% of the ticks. And the ticks sometimes had mixed infections about 7% of the time. So Borrelia and ticks to spread it are widespread throughout China. Unfortunately, I sent my kids to French immersion schools in grade school, so they're fluent in French. I should have sent them to a Chinese immersion school or an Indian immersion school so they would be able to speak to our future overlords. Bummer. Now, for years, it's been known that if you have strep bovis bacteremia and you have endocarditis, that you probably have an underlying bowel cancer. That association has been known for ever. It's always on the boards in some form or other. Now, strep bovis over the years has had increasing analysis of its genotype so that there's a lot of things that can be called strep bovis. One of them is now referred to as Streptococcus gallolyticus subspecies gallolyticus, also known as Streptococcus bovis biotype 1, and occasionally referred to as a purple symbol that's a combination of both the male and female signs. An obscure reference to Prince, for those of you who don't know popular music, or what used to pass for popular music. Anyway, why does this organism cause endocarditis, and why is it associated with bowel cancer? And it turns out this organism has some virulence characteristics that makes it likely to cause both colonization of cancer and endocarditis. One is it has the ability to cross epithelium without inducing an inflammatory response. So once it sneaks through the bloodstream, it does it without getting killed. However, and I quote here because I like the quote, importantly, they have an outstanding ability to form biofilms on collagen-rich surfaces. So, where can you find a lot of collagen in surfaces? Well, it turns out that both polyps and early colorectal tumors are characterized by, quote, a continuous expression of collagen type 4 in basement membranes, end quote. And this is also found on damaged valves. So this organism has a particular predilection for binding to collagen and covering itself with biofilm, both of which are found on polyps and on valves. When you combine that with its ability to invade across the endothelium without inciting an inflammatory response, you can then see why Strep gallolyticus, subspecies gallolyticus, is able to cause both colonization of polyps and, rarely, endocarditis. I think that's kind of cool. Gallolyticus, however, is not found in cheap wines. Kind of a gallows humor, huh? Oh, God, I'm clever. I recently had a patient with a ventricular peritoneal shunt who had a colonic perforation, and of course the worry is you get backflow up to cause meningitis. I have seen 3 or 4 cases of gram-negative meningitis due to VP shunts. In almost every case, the shunt migrated into the colon and poo went retrograde into the brain. Not a good thing. The surgeon, however, insisted that the valves in the shunt would prevent backflow to cause an infection. And I wondered, is that true? Didn't think it was based on clinical experience. Now, this trial was done in Groshong-type catheters, and they looked at whether or not bacteria could grow retrograde across the valve. And in fact, they could. Not surprisingly, I would think that at the level of the bacteria, any valve inside a catheter lumen would be the equivalent of an open garage door. So they looked at contamination beyond the valve in patients with catheters, and they could detect bacteria in this particular study in about 30% of catheters. They found it more likely to occur if pressure built up slowly, but the bottom line is that you cannot use the valve in these no-return catheters to prevent backflow and bacterial contamination. It probably applies to VP shunts as well. So, what do people like to do? Well, let's say you have a patient who's been sick and been placed on antibiotics, and they receive a course and the antibiotics are stopped. And then, shortly thereafter, the patient has a fever and looks infected again. What do people usually do? They usually restart the antibiotics you discontinued. Wrong. That is the stupid thing to do. Yet it's the common thing that people do because they don't think evolutionarily. Patients, when they get a new infection, are likely to be resistant to the antibiotics they were on before. Now, that's been my bias for years, and it's been proven this month. I so love being proven right. This was in critical care medicine, sometimes pronounced critical care medicine, and they looked at the effect of previous antibiotics in patients with gram-negative sepsis. And they found that if patients had been on antibiotics in the prior 90 days, they were more likely to have bugs in their blood, E. coli, Klebsiella, and Pseudomonas, that were resistant to the prior antibiotics. Big duh there. So as a result, they were put on inappropriate antibiotics more commonly, and they had a much higher mortality rate, 50% versus 34%. Of those that had not seen prior antibiotics. So take-home message. If you have a patient who's been on cefepime or meropenem or ciprofloxacin in the last 90 days, they come in sick, give them something different than what they had received before. Think like Darwin, not like Gish. My writings over at Science-Based Medicine have made me moderately skeptical about meta-analyses. The theory behind the meta-analysis is that if you take a bunch of cow pies and put them into one big pile, you end up with gold. Actually, what you end up with is a large pile of cow pies. I've become less enamored with them as a result. Garbage in, garbage out would tend to be the rule with meta-analyses. Be that as it may, there's yet another meta-analysis on probiotics and the prevention of antibiotic-associated colitis. I'll just throw out the results out there. See, I tend to think that the data does support probiotics to prevent antibiotic-associated colitis for sure. Never thought the data to prevent C. diff was quite as compelling, though I've read these articles in bits and pieces over the years. This article says, meta-analysis showed that administration of probiotics led to significantly relative risk reduction of 44% for antibiotic-associated diarrhea and 71% for Clostridium difficile-associated diarrhea. Now, in all of my institutions, we give patients who are on antibiotics yogurt that is rich in bacteria. I like to find the yogurt that most resembles poo. I think all yogurt resembles poo, and give it to our patients to help prevent antibiotic-associated diarrhea. Does it work, you might ask? How could you prove this? Well, all I can say is that when we instituted the widespread use of, in most of my institutions, it's Nancy's yogurt. When we instituted the yogurt that most resembles poo in our patients in antibiotics, our testing for C. difficile fell by about half. So I think that's a pretty good surrogate in our institutions that use of probiotics is having its desired effect. You may not guess it, but several hours have gone by, and I'm back from my daily constitutional to finish up with your favorite and mine, the hodgepodge. Okay, rifampicin causes ofloxacin to be pumped out of MTB to reduce the efficacy of rifampicin. Might be of importance, especially in this day and age with INH resistance, and we need to add quinolones to treat tuberculosis. Oh, crap. I just accidentally shut down all my files. Be back in a minute. I'm back. Did you miss me? Speaking of probiotics, which we're not, but I did, the study phase 2 looked at the use of vaginal probiotics to prevent urinary tract infections, and it cut the amount of UTIs by half. Small study with 100 premenopausal women, but it is an encouraging idea to prevent UTI. If you can decrease the adherence of, say, E. coli or other pathogens, you may prevent the adherence of pathogens and subsequent infections. So, it's intriguing. Streptococcus pneumoniae urine antigen. I thought it was only positive in people who had pneumonia. Well, it turns out not only is it common in kids because they're colonized, but in this study that was done in Thailand, 3% of women who were colonized and pregnant also had a positive urinary antigen. So there can be false positives in a subset of people who are heavily colonized with the organism. And, of course, we've talked in the past about how gastric acid suppressive drugs raise the risk of pneumonia. This is another study that looked at 430 adults in a case control trial and found that patients who were on acid suppressants had a threefold increased risk of community-acquired pneumonia, 2.8% versus 0.9%. Of course, it beats having that horrible gastritis. If it wasn't for acid suppressive agents, I never would have finished my internship. Cimetidine was the second best drug ever invented for me. The first, of course, is Thorazine. The voices get so tiresome after a while. This study looked at bacterial translocation in patients with trauma and indeed found it. Patients who had a high trauma score, in this case an abdominal trauma index of greater than 10, often developed bacterial translocation and subsequent infection. What is the riskiest food for causing a gastroenteritis? Chicken. And chicken gives you Campylobacter. But you say, well, I'm going to be a vegetarian. There's a recent outbreak of salmonella associated with cucumbers, and they had to recall 1,600 cases of Florida cucumbers. And then, okay, you're going to go back to meat. Well, not unsurprisingly, meat commonly have high levels of bacteria in them in a recent review, and not infrequently had resistant bacteria as well. They found that 96% of meats had staph, and they were often resistant to one type of antibiotic. I'm hardly surprised at this because you are what you eat, and I only eat resistant organisms. You can increase your yield slightly on blood cultures by pre-warming the blood cultures to 37. So rather than injecting into cold bacteria bottles, this study compared it to injecting it into warm bottles, and they had the blood cultures turn positive in a markedly reduced time. A difference of about 4 hours, which isn't bad. The sooner you can make the proper diagnosis, the sooner you can get people on proper antibiotics and decrease mortality and cost. So perhaps everybody should get 37-degree blood culture bottles when their blood cultures are drawn. When do you start antiretroviral therapy in patients with HIV disease? This was an observational study published in the Annals. They found that patients who had heart started at 500 cells had an increased AIDS-free survival, but it did not substantially alter mortality when compared to people who were started between 300 and 500. I still think it's heading that the higher the CD4 counts, the better off the patient is. Now, what do you do when you have discordant blood cultures? Your blood cultures are positive from the catheter, but negative peripherally. That's a tough word, peripherally. Well, it turns out that in this study, which looked at outcomes in those patients, that 8% of people subsequently had a bacteremia. They were more likely to have candidemia if they grew candida, and less likely to have bacteria if they grew bacteria from their discordant blood cultures. But still, in a patient with a Hickman, you shouldn't necessarily dismiss positive cultures from the Hickman as, quote, contaminant. I've talked about another study in the clinical infectious diseases where patients who had a catheter tip positive for Staph aureus but negative blood cultures were also more likely to develop bacteremia in the future. This looked at Group A strep in an LTEC facility. LTECs are places where vent patients go, etc. And they had 11 patients and 11 carriers develop Group A strep that spread amongst their hospital because, quote, suboptimal infection control practices were widespread. And the rule of thumb, you have to remember this when you take your ID boards, one Group A strep acquired in the hospital warrants an evaluation for its source. That's just one. So, how about Q fever? Well, it turns out that if you get Q fever while you're pregnant, it will cause abortion. And it looks in human beings that Q fever in Spain accounted for about 12% of spontaneous abortions in human beings. So, if you're a sheep keeper and you're pregnant, stay away from them there sheeps, don't you know? HIV patients have increased fracture rates compared to non-HIV patients. That's true even in the era of heart. Mono and low sun exposure both were associated with the development of MS in this study out of England. Of course, association is not causation, but still they're looking for a cause of MS. And mono is one of the organisms that has been blamed epidemiologically for multiple sclerosis. Again, influenza and pregnancy, bad combination. We talked a lot about how in the H1N1 outbreaks, there was an excess in mortality in pregnant women. This study also found an excess in hospitalizations due to influenza in pregnant women, and that in this study, being pregnant and getting H-flu is a major cause of getting in the hospital compared to your non-pregnant colleagues who got flu. And that ends the hodgepodge. Kind of a short podcast this month. Only 25 minutes instead of the usual 30 plus. I assumed you're really bummed not to have to listen to me babble away. So that ends this Puscast, a review of the ID literature that more or less came out in the last 2 weeks of April. It's CME accredited, so you can take the online quiz and get a half an hour free CME. This is brought to you by Pusware LLC. You can find all the wonderful things that make up the Mark Media growing, that make up the Mark Crislip growing multimedia empire at moremark.squarespace.com, where you can find blogs, you can find applications, you can find podcasts. It's amazing, because the world needs more Mark Crislip. This is copyright under the Creative Commons license, 2011. The music is by my son when he was 12 years old, improvising on the guitar. He turns 18 in just a week, and he's off to Syracuse. He's going to be an orange man, one of the few colleges that doesn't have a mascot, just a blob of orange paint. Go Syracuse. And that ends another Puscast. Thank you, as always, for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case, which doesn't have insurance. We'll continue to follow along with you. As always, thank you. In dictation, goodbye.